10 meters below the most famous opera house in the world, there is a lake. It is 25 meters wide and 50 meters long. It is completely dark. A large white catfish lives in it. The Paris Fire Department uses it to train their divers in pitch-black water. 3,000 people walk into the building above it every night, dressed for the opera, and not one of them has ever seen it. That is just one of them. There are 6 more. All of them inside buildings you would recognize from a postcard. All of them within walking distance of millions of tourists who will never know they were there. Some of these rooms hide objects. Some of them hide people. One of them hides an entire other building, and one of them was used by a man you have heard of to hide from a death sentence. And the things he drew on the walls there, with charcoal, were not supposed to be seen by anyone, ever. I am Tom. These are 7 rooms hidden inside Europe's most famous buildings. Number 7, the Paris Opera, France. In 1861, an architect named Charles Garnier was given the most important commission of his life: build the most beautiful opera house in the world. The emperor wanted it. Paris wanted it. Garnier wanted it. He had a problem. The site they had chosen for it was marshy. When his workers dug down to lay the foundations, the groundwater came back up. They installed wells. The water came back up. They installed 8 steam pumps that ran 24 hours a day for months. The water came back up. After almost a year of fighting the water, Garnier did something nobody expected. He stopped fighting it. More, he decided that if the water would not leave, he would build around it. He designed an enormous concrete cistern, 25 meters wide, 50 meters long, sealed on all sides, 10 meters below the stage. The weight of the water inside it would actually press down and stabilize the entire building above. It worked. The opera house went up. It opened in 1875. It is still one of the most famous buildings in Paris. And then in 1910, a French crime reporter named Gaston Leroux wrote a novel. Leroux had been inside the opera house. He had heard the rumors from the staff, and he had seen the cistern with his own eyes. In his novel, he turned it into a lake. He filled it with candles and gondolas. He invented a disfigured composer who lived beside it, kidnapping young sopranos and dragging them down through hidden passages to his underground palace. He called the book The Phantom of the Opera. It became one of the most successful stories of the 20th century. Most of what Leroux wrote was invented, but not all of it. The hidden passages are real. There are 2 of them. They start 5 floors below the basement of the opera, and climb all the way up to the 4th floor by way of a thin metal ladder. The chandelier is real. In 1896, one of the counterweights of the 7-ton chandelier above the auditorium broke loose during a performance and crashed through the ceiling. A woman in the audience was killed. Leroux put that scene in his novel almost exactly as it had happened. And in 1907, workers in the opera buried a time capsule in the cellar. 24 phonograph recordings of the most famous opera singers of the era, sealed in lead containers, to be opened 100 years later. While they were digging, they found human bones. Leroux claimed in his novel that they were the bones of his disfigured architect. They were not. They were almost certainly the bones of prisoners from the Paris Commune, who had been held in the unfinished opera cellars in 1871 and were never seen again. Today, the cistern is still there. The water has been there for 160 years. Nobody has ever drained it. The one time the management tried, the building above it began to shift, and they stopped immediately and refilled it. A large white catfish lives in the water. The opera staff feed it. Nobody knows how old it is. The only people allowed down there are the Paris Fire Brigade. They use the cistern to train their divers in pitch-black water, practicing rescues that they hope will never be needed in the building above. 3,000 people sit in the auditorium every night. They look up at the ceiling where the chandelier still hangs. They do not look down. Number 6. The Colosseum, Italy. From a cistern under one stage in Paris to 15,000 square meters of stage machinery under another, built almost 2,000 years earlier. The Colosseum is the most visited ancient building in the world. 6 million people walk through it every year. They see the seats. They see the arches. They see the broken floor. What they do not see is the thing the broken floor was hiding. Because for almost the entire history of the Colosseum, that floor was made of wood, covered in sand, and the entire purpose of it was to hide what was underneath. The Romans called it the hippogrium, from the Greek word for under the earth. A 2-story labyrinth of stone corridors, cells, ramps, and machinery, 15,000 square meters in total, sitting directly below the floor of the arena. There were 80 wooden lifts down there, powered by counterweights and turned by slaves. 32 trapdoors connected them to the arena floor above. A central tunnel led under the road outside the Colosseum to a building called the Ludus Magnus, the gladiator school where the fighters lived, ate, and trained with wooden weapons because the guards were afraid they would kill themselves with real ones. It is the year 90 AD. Should the crowd above sees an empty arena. There's a sound from below. A trapdoor opens. A lion comes up out of the floor. Then another one. Then a man with a sword who has no idea where the next lion will appear. Neither does anyone in the audience. That is the entire point. The hippodrome was the special effects department of the ancient world. Animals, fighters, scenery, and entire stage sets could rise up out of the ground in seconds. The crowd could not predict any of it. For the men and animals waiting below, it was hell. There was almost no ventilation, no natural light. The air was full of dust and the smell of fear. Lions and bears and elephants were kept in cages along the corridors, sometimes for days before being hoisted up to die. After Rome fell, the hippodrome was forgotten. People filled it with rubble, planted vegetable gardens in it. They stored hay there. By the early 1800s, the floor of the hippodrome lay buried under 12 meters of dirt. Most Romans did not even know it existed. In 1813, archaeologists tried to dig it out. They could not get past the groundwater. They tried again in 1874. Same result. It was not finally cleared until 1930. And it was not cleared by archaeologists who were curious about it. It was cleared by Benito Mussolini, who needed ancient Rome as a backdrop for his own propaganda. In June 2021, the hippogrium was opened to the public for the first time in almost 2,000 years. Tickets are limited. Tours are guided. If you stand on the new floor of the Colosseum today, but you are standing on the ceiling of the room where 80,000 people and 1 million animals died for the entertainment of the city above. Number 5. The Hagia Sophia, Turkey. From a Roman secret that everyone forgot about, to one that nobody knew was there until last year. The Hagia Sophia is 1,500 years old. It has been a Christian cathedral, then a mosque, then a museum, and is now a mosque again. 3 million people visit it every year. It is one of the most photographed buildings on Earth. Architects and historians have been studying it for over 1,000 years. In 2024, a restoration team began work on the foundations. The goal was earthquake protection, a routine engineering job. They found 3 chambers. Then they found 7 tunnels, hundreds of meters long, in connecting the chambers to each other. Then they found a tomb. The tomb has 3 rooms. It sits 4 meters below the northeast facade of the Hagia Sophia. And it is older than the Hagia Sophia itself. It dates from the 4th century. Constantinople was barely 150 years old when whoever is buried in that tomb was placed there. This means something strange. It means that when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian built the Hagia Sophia in the year 537, his architects knew about the tomb, and they chose to leave it where it was, 4 meters beneath their new cathedral. Over 1,000 tons of dirt have been removed from those tunnels since work began. 600 meters of tunnel have been mapped. Hundreds more are still blocked by debris. Nobody is sure what the tunnels were originally for. Some archaeologists think they were ventilation shafts. The Hagia Sophia is enormous, and the tunnels would have helped circulate air. Others think they were drainage channels for rainwater, but others think the tunnels had a different purpose. They think they were used for religious rituals, secret services in the early Christian centuries, when Christianity was still mixed with older traditions and not yet the official religion of the empire. And some think they were escape routes, built for the Byzantine emperors, who lived right next door in the Great Palace, in case they needed to disappear. Nobody knows who is buried in the tomb beneath the cathedral. The Turkish government has not yet decided whether to open the tunnels to the public. For now, nobody is allowed down there. The arteries of the Hagia Sophia are being slowly cleared, 1 bucket of dirt at a time, after 1,600 years. If you are still here, consider subscribing. The strongest entries are still to come. Number 3 is the one that made me stop and just sit with it for a moment. Number 4. The Palace of Versailles, France. From tunnels nobody knew were there, to a mirror nobody knows is a door. The Palace of Versailles is the most famous palace in the world. 7 million visitors pass through it every year. They walk the Hall of Mirrors. They see the king's apartments. They see the queen's bedroom. In the queen's bedroom, on one wall, there is a tall, gold-framed mirror. Tourists walk past it. They take pictures of themselves in it. They see their own reflection. What they do not see is that the mirror is a door. Marie Antoinette came to Versailles in 1770. She was 14 years old. She had been sent from Vienna to marry the future king of France, a boy she had never met. She hated the court. The etiquette of Versailles dictated who handed her her shirt in the morning, who watched her get dressed, who was allowed in the room when she ate breakfast. When she gave birth to her first child, 30 courtiers were required by law to stand in the room and watch. In 1781, her husband, who by then was King Louis XVI, gave her a private gift. A series of small rooms hidden directly behind her bedroom, accessible only through a door disguised as a mirror. The apartment was on 2 floors. There was a small chamber called the Meridienne, and with a daybed in a mirrored alcove where she could nap during the day. There was a gold room decorated with Egyptian motifs, because Pompeii had recently been rediscovered, and Egypt was the new fashion. There was a library with false book spines hiding the doors. There was even a billiard room. This is where she read. This is where she met her closest friends, including the Princesse de Lamballe, who would later be torn apart by a Paris mob in front of a prison gate. This is where she played with her 4 children. Nobody from the court came in. Nobody from the court even knew about the door. It is the night of October the 5th, 1789. A crowd from Paris is marching on Versailles. They are angry about bread. They are angry about taxes. They are mostly women. They are coming for the queen. The queen is asleep. A guard pounds on her door. He tells her to run. She has seconds. She opens the mirror. She runs barefoot through her hidden rooms, in her nightclothes, across to the king's apartments on the other side. A few hours later, the mob forces the royal family into a carriage and takes them to Paris. 3 years and 4 months later, Marie Antoinette is taken from a prison cell to the guillotine in a wooden cart. The apartment was emptied after the revolution. The furniture was sold. The wall hangings disappeared. For 230 years, the secret rooms behind the mirror were either closed or used as storage, or partially restored and then closed again. In 2018, the palace began a 5-year restoration. Conservators searched the linings of old sofas for fragments of the original silk. They found a piece of lilac, which had been Marie Antoinette's favorite color. They reproduced it. They rehung the walls in the exact pattern of pineapples that had hung there in 1784. Pineapples were a symbol of wealth in 18th century France because they had to be grown in heated greenhouses. In June 2023, the mirror swung open again. Tour groups can now go inside in small numbers by appointment. If you stand in the Queen's bedroom today, in front of the gold-framed mirror, and you do not know exactly where to push, you will not find the door. Number 3. The Medici Chapels, Florence. There is one entry on this list that is different from all the others. It does not have a queen or a mob or a palace. It has one man, one room, and 2 months. Florence, 1530. The Florentine Republic has just fallen. The Medici family is back in power. And the head of the Medici family, Pope Clement VII, in Rome, has just issued an order. Michelangelo Buonarroti was at that moment the most famous living artist in Europe. He had painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He had carved the David. He had made the Pietà. He was 55 years old. He was a legend. 3 years earlier, he had made a mistake. He had joined the Florentine Republic, the short-lived government that had thrown the Medici out of Florence in 1527. He had not just supported the rebels. He had designed the city's military fortifications, the walls that were meant to keep the Medici out forever. The walls did not hold, and the Medici came back in 1530, and Pope Clement, head of the Medici family, ordered Michelangelo's death. The man who saved him was the prior of the Church of San Lorenzo, a man named Giovanni Battista Figiovanni. He hid Michelangelo underneath the new sacristy, in a small room that Michelangelo himself had designed, but that was buried directly under the floor of the chapel he was building. 10 meters long, 3 meters wide, 2.5 meters high, 1 window at street level. Michelangelo lived in that room for 2 months, from late June to late October, alone, in the half-dark, and he drew on the walls. With charcoal and red chalk on the white plaster, he drew sketches for the sculptures that were being carved directly above his head. Me the legs of Giuliano de' Medici, a member of the family that was trying to kill him. The head of the Laocoon, figures that would appear years later in his finished work. Nobody was ever supposed to see those drawings. In October 1530, the Pope changed his mind. He pardoned Michelangelo. 4 years later, Michelangelo left Florence forever. He went to Rome and never came back. The room under the chapel was plastered over, forgotten. For 400 years, almost nobody knew it had ever existed. In the 20th century, it became a coal cellar. Then in 1955, it was sealed off entirely. A wardrobe was pushed in front of the trapdoor that led down into it and stayed there for the next 20 years. In 1975, the director of the Medici Chapels Museum was looking for a new fire exit for the building. His name was Paolo dal Poggetto. He noticed the trapdoor under the wardrobe. He pulled it open. He climbed down. He suspected what it might be. He asked a restorer named Sabino Giovannoni to test the walls. Giovannoni scraped away at the plaster very gently. Underneath the first layer, he found another layer. Underneath the second layer, he found dozens of drawings. Charcoal, red chalk, faces, legs, heads. The hand of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Dal Poggetto looked at them and said, "This is Michelangelo." Some scholars today are not so sure. The drawings are not signed. Of the dozens of figures on the walls, the most cautious experts now say that only 6 or 7 are definitely the master's own work, because the rest may be by his students. or by other artists who came down into the room later. But the consensus is this: whoever drew them, whoever was down there with charcoal and a wall and a death sentence over their head, the hand belonged to a master. The room was too fragile to open. The charcoal was too sensitive to light. For almost 50 years after the rediscovery, it remained closed to the public. Only academics could go in, and only by special permission, and only briefly. In November 2023, the room was open to visitors for the first time in its 500-year history. The rules are strict: 4 people at a time, 15 minutes inside. Tickets sell out the moment they go on sale. He drew on those walls because he believed that no one would ever see them. Now 4 people at a time stand in the dark. And look at the things he made when he thought his life was over. After Michelangelo, the rest of this list gets quieter. The secrets get older. But the ground starts to feel less solid. Number 2, Westminster Abbey, London. From Michelangelo's 2 months, back almost 500 years further, to a room that was built before he was born, before his grandfather was born, before anyone in Europe knew that the world was round. Westminster Abbey is where every British monarch has been crowned for almost 1,000 years. Charles Darwin is buried there. Isaac Newton is buried there. Stephen Hawking is buried there. In one of the walls of the East Cloister, there is a heavy oak door. It has 7 locks. Behind the door is a low room with a stone groin-vaulted ceiling. It was built around the year 1070. It is one of the oldest rooms still standing in England. The door itself is the oldest surviving door in England. The wood was cut from oak trees that were felled around the year 1050. The trees were older than the Norman king who conquered the country. The room is called the Pyx Chamber. In the late 13th century, King Edward I, England's most powerful medieval ruler, the one who tried to conquer Scotland, made it his royal treasury. It was the most secure place the medieval world knew. It held crowns, silver plates, ceremonial swords, goblets of gold and enamel, treaties with foreign kings. On the 6th of June, 1303, Edward ordered an investigation. Most of his treasure was missing, but suspicion fell immediately on the abbot and the 48 monks of Westminster Abbey. All of them were arrested. All of them were taken to the Tower of London. All of them were questioned for weeks. Eventually, the real culprit was found. His name was Richard Pudlicott. He was a poor gentleman from Oxfordshire with a grudge against the king. According to his confession, he had spent 4 months prying stones out of the outer wall of the chapter house, working at night, until he had made a hole large enough to climb through. Once inside, he took whatever he could carry: royal cups, silver dishes, gold. He sold the smaller items in pawn shops across London. The bigger items he gave to accomplices. He was caught when the pawn shops started reporting suspicious royal silverware to the king's men. The Pudlicott was wheeled in a barrow from the tower to a public gallows and hanged. For 700 years afterwards, a story was told. The story said that Pudlicott's skin had been flayed from his body and nailed to the door of the Pyx Chamber as a warning to future thieves. Visitors stared in horror at the patches of dried tissue still clinging to the ancient oak. In 2005, scientists examined the tissue under a microscope. It was cowhide. It had always been cowhide. It had been put there in the 11th century as decoration to soften the appearance of the door. The whole story about Pudlicott being skinned was invented somewhere between the 15th and 17th centuries and repeated by tour guides for hundreds of years. After that, that part of the story is folklore. The next part is not. As for the monks, who almost certainly worked with Pudlicott, the king never quite trusted Westminster Abbey again. He moved much of his treasure into the Tower of London where it would be guarded by his own soldiers, not by men in robes. The Pyx chamber still has its medieval tiled floor. It still has an oak chest from the 13th century, in which ceremonial swords were once kept. It still has a stone altar that was put in around the time the English were beginning to forget the Latin language. The 7 locks on the door still work. 3 million people visit Westminster Abbey every year. Almost none of them know the room is there. Number 1. Edinburgh Castle, Scotland. I want to take you back to where we started, back to the lake under the Paris Opera, back to the idea that the most famous buildings in Europe are full of rooms you can stand right next to and never see. The last entry on this list is the biggest version of that idea I could find. It is not a room hidden inside a building. It is a building hidden inside a building. Edinburgh Castle sits on top of an extinct volcano in the center of Edinburgh. It is visible from almost every street in the city. It is the most visited paid attraction in Scotland. 2 million people walk through it every year. If you go there today, you will walk past the eastern side of the castle. There is a massive curved stone wall there. It is called the Half Moon Battery. It was built in the late 1500s. There are old cannons mounted on top of it. They point down into the city. Tourists take pictures. They see masonry. They see a wall. What they do not see is that there is another castle inside the wall. David's Tower was begun in 1367 by King David II of Scotland, the son of Robert the Bruce. He never saw it finished. He died in 1371, and his successor Robert II completed the tower in the late 1370s. It stood over 30 meters high. In its time, it was one of the most powerful fortifications in Britain. It was where the kings of Scotland held court. It was where the most important rooms in the country sat. In 1440, it was where the Black Dinner happened. If you have ever watched Game of Thrones, you may already know this story. George R. R. Martin used it as the inspiration for the Red Wedding in his novels. The 10-year-old King James II of Scotland was sitting at the head of a table. The 16-year-old William Douglas, Earl of Douglas, and his younger brother had been invited to a feast. The food was served, the wine was poured. Then a black bull's head was brought in on a silver platter and placed in front of the two brothers. It was the medieval Scottish symbol for death. The Earl and his brother were dragged out into the courtyard in front of the weeping young king and beheaded. In 1573, after a 2-year siege, English artillery finally broke David's Tower. It collapsed. The Scots thought the castle was lost. It was not. But when the castle was rebuilt, the architects made a strange decision. Instead of clearing the rubble of David's Tower away, they built a new defensive wall around it. A massive curved wall, the Half Moon Battery. For more than 3 centuries, David's Tower sat directly underneath the wall that everybody saw. Every visitor to Edinburgh Castle walked over it. Nobody knew it was there. The castle had simply forgotten about its own keep. In 1912, the chief architect of the Scottish Office of Works, a man named William Thomas Oldreive, was working on the buildings inside the castle. Another architect, 30 years earlier, had suggested that part of David's Tower might still survive underneath the Half Moon Battery. Oldreive decided to find out. He broke through the pavement on top of the battery and dropped into the dark. What he found was the lost tower, not a foundation, not a fragment. The lower section of David's Tower was still standing, almost 15 meters high, on walls 3 meters thick, stone staircases, doorways. The remains of the great hall where the Black Dinner had been served, almost 500 years earlier. An entire medieval tower had been forgotten inside the most famous castle in Scotland, just below the surface that millions of tourists had walked across over the centuries. 339 years had passed since the cannons silenced David's Tower. Until Oldreeve, nobody had thought to dig. There is one more thing about David's Tower that you should know. During the Second World War, when an invasion of Britain looked possible, the honors of Scotland, the crown, the scepter, and the sword of state of the Scottish kingdom, the oldest crown jewels in Britain, were quietly removed from their display case in the crown room of Edinburgh Castle. They were taken down into David's Tower by torchlight by 3 men. They were buried in a medieval latrine, the kind of small stone shaft that the original castle had used as a toilet 600 years earlier. Then the entrance was sealed. Only those 3 men knew where they were. If the Germans had landed, and if all 3 of them had been killed in the fighting, no one would have known where the crown of Scotland was buried. It would still be down there now. The crown is back in its case today. The latrine is empty. David's Tower is open to visitors again. You can book a tour and walk through what is left of it. But the principle is still the same. There is a castle inside the castle, and it sat there, hidden in plain sight, for centuries before anyone bothered to look. Beneath the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, a tomb older than the building above it sits in the dark, waiting to be opened. In the cistern under the Paris Opera, a white catfish swims in pitch-black water that nobody is allowed to see. In a coal cellar under Florence, 4 people at a time stand in the room where Michelangelo hid from a death sentence and drew pictures he never wanted anyone to see. Under a paving stone in Edinburgh, an entire medieval tower waited 339 years for somebody to notice it. The buildings on this list are some of the most photographed in the world. Millions of people walk past these rooms every year. They do not see them. That is what makes them secret. Not that they are locked, but that they are looked at and missed. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe. There are more rooms like these in Europe than I had time for in one video. I am Tom. Thank you for watching.